Let me, we haven't tested sharing the screen. Let's see. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep, perfect.
Yeah. Right. Cool. Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. So today's presentation will be me and Victor. It will be on this text we wrote together called, it's kind of hard to translate. So it's O Trampo da Treta, which is an inversion of Treta no Trampo, which was one of the channels that produced videos on the career strikes. So it translates a bit like instead of being the like conflict at work, when you invert it, it becomes a bit like the work you take to do the struggle. So we translate it as the hustle of struggle. And it's basically like a reflection, like Victor and I throughout 2020 and 2021, we participated in these career strikes, helping to like make material, like write stuff and make videos and organize throughout this cycle of national strikes that happened in Brazil during the pandemics. And we talked a lot through it. He was in Goiânia and I was in São Paulo. And the text is a bit the outcome of this sort of like reflecting on this experience. I don't know how many of you managed to read it. But we will try to give like a summary, like a case study, a bit like my last presentation. So we'll start with a bit of trying to like give you a bit of a feel of like the complexity of this political movement, and then go to the text and try to relate it to I made an effort to relate it back to our concepts that we've been developing in STP, and also with the previous presentation. I don't know if Victor, do you want to say something?
I think it's important to note that while Renzo was more of a outsider support, at least initially, of the career movement, I participated in a sort of open collective of careers as a sort of communications accessory. So it was a bit of a different experience, and I think I will speak more about the experience of Goiânia and how it is different to the experience of São Paulo. But I think it's because we had different experiences that we could manage to reflect and produce something about our collective defeats.
Yeah. So, this is a picture of some of the core organizers in São Paulo. Here behind it's MASP, and these pyramids became a bit of a symbol of the movement, of the strikes, because they would use their sort of like working bags where they carry the food and then pile it up to sort of like signal that they are blocking a certain like a space, like a shopping center or like a McDonald's. And I had a hard time deciding which picture to use, but this is another one with just like a single career. I think it represents a bit of the impasse. Okay, yeah, I think we had the idea of showing a video, like two videos actually. Let me see if it will work. The first one is like a video clip that the Treta no Trampo, this channel made, that was close to the movement, made on informal work and work it throughout the pandemics. I think it gives a bit of like the sort of general vibe of that is the context where the protests appeared during the pandemic. So let's see if it works. It's just if I play, can you hear the sound well?
Mais a todos os autônomos que sempre dão um jeito de se virar nas maiores
Does that work? Okay.
Yeah.
So let's do it. It's called Rap of Informal Workers.
Salve a todos os informais, a todos os autônomos, que sempre dão um jeito de se virar nas maiores adversidades. Adversidades que por vezes tiram a nossa própria vida, como no caso do marreteiro Billy Joe, rimador de trem, morto pelo coronavírus. Esse rap é dedicado a ele e a todos os trabalhadores vítimas do corona. Sempre teve lá, nunca deixou de ralar, criticado por achar um jeito de se virar. Família Shopping Trem, o meu abraço, correndo dos guardinhas pra cima e pra baixo. Os que sempre criticava agora vem falar que reconhece o nosso trampo e que nós tem que trabalhar. Muito obrigado, tu tá ligado, agradeço o reconhecimento, mas saiba por do lado. Agora dão duas opções pra quem é pobre, morrer na rua de corona ou em casa de fome. Agora dão duas opções pra quem é pobre, morrer na rua de corona ou em casa de fome. Entre morrer em casa e morrer na rua, eu prefiro nenhuma das duas. Nunca acreditei nos caras lá de cima, eles nunca vão mudar, não vai ser na pandemia. Pobre, pra eles tem que sempre se fuder, nunca tiveram preocupado nem com o que nós vai comer, se vamos morrer num acidente. Um salve pros motor, linha de frente. Agora dão duas opções pra quem é pobre, morrer na rua de corona ou em casa de fome. Agora dão duas opções pra quem é pobre, morrer na rua de corona ou em casa de fome. Entre morrer em casa e morrer na rua, eu prefiro nenhuma das duas. Acho engraçado que a solução é sempre fuder com o pobre, não mexer com os grandão. Cadê o dono do Itaú que ninguém fala? Tem mais dinheiro na conta que grão de arroz na minha casa. Acho engraçado que a solução é sempre fuder com o pobre, não mexer com os grandão. Cadê o dono do Itaú que ninguém fala? O Lema, os marinhos e a porra do Safra. Agora dão duas opções pra quem é pobre, morrer na rua de corona ou em casa de pobre. Sempre fizeram impossível pra se virar, agora a criatividade vai ter que dobrar. Não tem uma solução, vamos ter que encontrar. Os caras não der, vamos ter que arrancar. Aí, rapaziada, vamos se cuidar, vamos fazer o máximo para evitar a propagação do vírus. Cuidar dos mais velhos, cuidar do grupo de risco. Senão vai morrer muita gente querida nossa. Mas aí, cadê o álcool gel? Cadê as máscaras? E esse auxílio de R$600? Pergunta para os caras que aprovou isso aí, se eles vivem com R$600 por mês. Isso aí é o mínimo. O pessoal continua trabalhando, tem que ter proteção. O pessoal da saúde aí super exposto. Ninguém quer parabéns do governo, não. Nós queremos proteção, condição de trabalho, contratação de pessoas. A gente não é descartável, ligado? E para o resto dos trabalhadores, que não é de serviço essencial, tem que ficar em casa. O governo tem que bancar nós ficar em casa. A gente sempre trabalhou, a gente sempre produziu. Agora é hora de tirar do ciclo. Tem uns caras aí com bilhões. Tira dos caras e banca nós ficar em casa até essa doença passar. A gente não é descartável, a gente pode morrer na rua trabalhando. Aí, rapaziada, quem gostou, compartilha aí. Vamos ver até onde chega essas ideias. Se tiver vídeo também, quiser mandar um relato aí da situação no seu trampo, tua família, no seu bairro, ou simplesmente mandar as ideias, só mandar na página do Treta, deixando o endereço aqui embaixo, a gente compartilha. Se nós não pensar na nossa sobrevivência, ninguém vai pensar.
Yeah, so I mean, this video is from, it's before the national strikes. So at this point, I was close to them and we were just like trying to map different protests and the conflicts at work and the sort of like difficulties that people were passing through it. And then you start to see it in the city, like, so you have this massive problem of work and the work in the apps grow a lot in São Paulo. So it becomes just this massive occupation for people looking to get some money in the economic crisis throughout the pandemics. And this sort of like many protests in different regions of the city and different like cities in Brazil were sort of like popping up. And yeah, we started to do videos on that, and very quickly like the careers and people involved realized that all these protests were happening like asynchronously, like they were like called on WhatsApp groups, and people were like just like fed up a certain day and just said like we have to do something, and just call their sort of like friends that worked with them in the delivery, and they would just like decide to like close the street and make this bag pyramid and try to like claim it, call attention of the media, or they maybe would go to a bridge and close it. But all of that was happening like in many different regions, like every week one of those were happening. And then like people decided to sort of like coordinate and try to like call like a single unified national day. So, and that was just done like in a poll on WhatsApp. It wasn't like, you know, like how it's usually done. Like there's, I don't know, maybe a union that decides and votes in assembly. It was just like informally done in a group with many people. And then once it was decided day, it just became this sort of like call for the day. And then videos of people like recording themselves. Let me see if I can show quickly one. They would record selfies from different cities that were sort of like answering to the call, and then this sort of like massive viralized, and the first national strike actually seemed to be something that was going to happen. Let me go back to so this is the some of the material that was calling for like this first national strike. So you can see that there is, I mean, there was these two sort of like tactics that were used at that point. So couriers on bikes would normally just make like a parade and go throughout the city, calling attention and just like making traffic jams, or they would block like stores and shopping centers. So the idea for the day was sort of doing a hybrid thing where people met on different zones of the city. So here we're talking about São Paulo. So imagine it's like this massive city with different regions. So the idea was to meet on different, each one of this is an address where the idea was to meet there, block all the deliveries throughout lunch, and then meet all of them sort of like converge on a single spot in MASP, and then do a long sort of parade until this main bridge in São Paulo to gain attention of the media. So there was like this tension between like blocking the workplace, where it's like the sort of like deliveries go out, and make like and you can block like a store with like as many as like 5 couriers. So it's not very spectacular, while the parades were very spectacular because it put like thousands of people of bikes and together, and it was easier to catch attention the way. So on one hand, you could put pressure directly on the app, because you would like do a problem with the deliveries. On the other hand, you would like target the more like the media visibility and the sort of like territory of the city. So they were playing with these two sort of sides. So there was like lots of materials that were printed and put on the bags, on these bags like here. So they would like do their ad, instead of making like publicity for the companies, they started to do publicity for the strike. And these stickers were printed. This was an idea that went completely wrong, like failed completely, but it gives a bit sort of like where we're trying to get. We just made like these flags, like, you know, like old warriors that carried like in their horses. So the idea was that different zones of the city would sort of like have their color and coalesce in a single point. But it didn't work. But yeah, but the idea was this idea of sort of coordinating this massive strike in the whole city. So this is just an image of, and this tactic of like interrupting the deliveries of a place was called breque, which is like break. It's like pressing the brake, so like interrupting the spot. And you had this at the day of the strike, you had this in many zones of the city in different ways. So the WhatsApp groups were the way that people shared to know that the thing was happening. And then later in the day, there was like this parade. And then at the end of the day, there was like this first moment of tension, which was, it is it's a category of autonomous workers, which are very, I mean, they have this union, which is the sort of like historical union that represents CLT workers, which are not autonomous workers, they are ones with contracts. So, and the autonomous app couriers, basically most of them hate this union. So many, and especially the organizer, were very frustrated that day in this this part of the day, that at the bridge, that everyone converged at the bridge, the union managed to sort of like guide the whole parade with their car, the sound car, and there were like this more classical trade unionist sort of like speeches. And on the other hand, there was like this big, how do you call it? Like a flag? No, like a banner. With trying to like, because I mean, couriers were placing a lot of like faith on this day being the like sort of the D-Day, and the war continues was a bit like, it's a long war, and it also like a lot of the sort of like images in the day-to-day of deliveries is sort of like war-like expressions. And so there's a lot of this imagery of like surviving sort of like harsh conditions of the streets and the market. And so it sort of like talks to that. Yeah, so I mean, just want to mark this because later throughout the movement, it becomes like always an important point of tension, the relationship between the careers and the official unions and new unions. Like, to give an idea, the new unions that appeared, they wouldn't use the name sindicato, they call themselves associação, just to like distance themselves. So there's always this tension in the autonomous category, which is like a bit on one hand, like an affirmation of a certain distance they want to keep from the sort of like official unions that were mostly like traditionally in Brazil, like many became like a sort of apparatus of the state, so they not really like one of the workers. So there was like a skepticism about that, which it's like one of the open impasses of the movement. And then, I mean, Victor, do you want to, if you want to join in at some point, like just interrupt me. But
this first part, you are more involved.
Yeah. And here in São Paulo, like after this first national strike, which was pretty impressive, like there were like dozens of places that were like stopped, and this massive parade, we started to organize for a second strike. They on like one in 30 days. So we had to start everything again to like spread the word and etc. And in this process, like this sort of group organized collective of couriers formed, which was called like Couriers of the Break. And there were like t-shirts, and it was like the most, probably in São Paulo, the moment that it was like more organized as a sort of like public group that sort of tried to not represent in the sense of the union to the state, but a bit of sort of coordinate and sort of like induce other strikers. So it was the most sort of like sense unified sort of like and largest organized collective that there was in São Paulo of couriers, but it didn't last too much. I mean, there were other sort of like people trying to organize. There were like, I mean, the protests were very decentralized. How do you say, like decentralized? But this was one of the efforts to sort of like have representatives of each of the regions of the city in one single space that could sort of decide the next steps. And there was this day that we tried to gather attention for the second strike, which was trying to build like the largest pyramid in history with like the bags. And then the media was called and there were interviews. So this was all before. So a lot of energy was put on this, like, and we made these actions like in different regions of the city calling for the second strike, which was on 25th of July. So these are different like regions of the city. So you can imagine the amount of like, it was like basically like 20, 30 couriers and non-couriers trying to like glue a sticker with the info in every bag that was seen in the city. So there was like a massive effort on that. And the day was very frustrating, the second national strike, because it didn't, there were like some important breaks, but when they converged at the middle of the day, there was like just maybe 100 couriers, and there was like lots of media, almost more media than couriers. And then there were like fights because there were already like tensions building up. There were like, it was at the moment that the couriers were sort of like interpreted as being a position themselves or not, in terms of being against or in favor of the government, of Bolsonaro government. So some in the media read the protests as sort of like anti-fascist movement, and then the couriers themselves some of them got mad that there was this line of interpretation of them. And so it was something, the electoral message, the positioning was something that divided a lot the movement. And that's why the movement tried to distance itself from any electoral position regarding the government and focus on the sort of like demands that were increasing the rates, stopping like what they had, the app sort of block arbitrarily the riders. So one of the main demands was the increasing the rates that were getting lower and lower, and stopping the sort of these arbitrary punishments of the platform. And 3, there was like this general call for more respect. So it's interesting also, there's like this economic demand is more like punishment demand, like more state-like, and this more of sort of like dignity demand. And but they all stick to these very concrete demands normally. This is the material for like the second national strike. The war continues. And the day was a bit very frustrating. So this was basically the first phase, what in the text is described as the first phase in São Paulo. Then I just put some, I didn't prepare that much regarding the second and third phase, but just to give some idea, like this is one of the important dimensions of the movement, was aiming at the image of the app. So the app, although it cares about the losses they get from like the strike, this data is not public, right? So even the couriers don't know how much the app lost. But the public image is something that is like a sort of like permanent damage, and they're very afraid. So one of the things that were coordinated a lot was using the social networks to spread consumer campaigns, especially with like leftists, people that are sensitive to the strike. And that worked very well. They basically like trashed the reviews of the app in the store, and this sort of double action with the strike, so the physical strike and the sort of social network effects, was sort of like important aspects that made it gain sort of like attention of the apps, of the companies, and of the media. This is one of the sort of interventions we did. It was like one of the blockages, like we did this inflatable, just saying it's the worst company in the world. And this is one of the campaigns of the users. That Greta, who is here, did. Then this is interesting, like in this later phase after the national strikes, there was still a core of organized couriers that sort of tried to keep on. So that group, the Entregadores do Break, they sort of diluted a lot and dissolved. Many got frustrated with how much like hard it was to organize. It's a workforce that is like almost uncountable. Like you just have like, they just pour everywhere. So when you do a strike, it's very frustrating. You see people on the streets. You cannot like just like close the doors of the factory, right? You have the constant pouring, and those that are like on the streets are working. So you see sort of like the other worker working and gaining, and you are sort of like fighting for him. So there's a lot of like tension in this movement that led to a lot of frustration. People eventually left and new people join. So there's this constant sort of refurbishing of the frontliners that are the organizers. It's really hard to like just stay with the same people. But there was this small core that started to like travel and try to create a network, a national network between careers to sort of like have a more sort of like an entity that was national level and could sort of like make decisions. And one of the banners that was sort of like which is curious, is that they carried this banner, which became a bit of a symbol of this group, which was like Motoboys, which is the careers without union. So it was like careers united without a union. And this appealed a lot to many careers. It was like people identify with this message. Like we're not like the politicians that are part of the unions. We are uniting without getting sort of like our hands sort of like caught in what we call in Portuguese politicagem, which is like the sort of the politics of every day. I don't know how to translate that. So there was this strong attempt to create this autonomous organization of the careers. And one important aspect was there was like also, again, the visibility of the thing. There was this YouTuber that's called Half that made lives of the everyday life and also of the protest. So this is one of the blockades in which we sort of like live streamed the protest in his channel, which was, I think it's interesting. Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I'm just going to show one of the videos of the Treta no Trampo channel that was done, that it has subtitles. I chose because it has subtitles, so I think it can give you a bit of the sort of vibe of it. Now, how do I select? Just a second.
Bom dia.
Okay, it's another 3 minutes. Should I just play it?
Bom dia.
Can you hear it?
I think so.
Okay.
Bom dia, cachorro loucos. Então, mano, não tá ligado que hoje é paralisação, né? Dos aplicativos aí nacional, mano.
Aí a massa tá com a gente, hein? Tem que fazer um bagulho mais radical. Tem que parar tudo, travar, brincar.
Tirar de giro, passar perto, fica meia hora em cada pico, o cara fica com medo, falou, porra, os caras é um monte. Dia 25/7 será o segundo break dos aplicativos nacional.
Cambuci, base da RAP, vazio. Sucesso aí, motoca. Sucesso aí, galera da bike.
Vila Olímpia, ó o galpãozinho da log lá, o portãozinho aberto. Nenhum motoca. O galpão da log tá dominado!
Pode vir polícia, pode vir tudo. Não vai sair pedido no Shopping Morumbi, mano. Não sai pedido hoje, entendeu? Shopping Morumbi aqui travado, caralho. Ninguém tira pedido.
Aqui no Acre, ó, Brecão é o principal restaurante que mais vende aqui, ó. Ninguém tira pedido, nem Uber de carro não tá tirando pedido aqui, ó. Ninguém.
Enquanto não melhorar nossas taxas de entrega, ninguém entra, ninguém sai. Já era.
Eu vim pra trampar, tá ligado? Mas eu não vou só por cima dos caras. Vou apoiar os caras agora nas situações, entendeu? Tamo junto, mano. O negócio é o seguinte, ninguém trabalhar hoje. Esse é o certo.
Nós tá fechando o Goiânia Shopping aqui em Goiânia, ó. Ó a galera.
Vamos fazer o seguinte, reúne um grupo. Se tiver um grupo da hora, separa e vai fechar qualquer coisa. Daqui a gente vai reunir um grupo lá pro Vila Nativo, pro McDonald's. Fechar o Mac de lá e mandar assim também.
Vem colar que o periferia tá brincado, ó. Ó, tá brincado!
Do mesmo jeito que eles bloqueiam nós e nós não trabalhamos, nós vamos bloquear as entregas dele e eles não vão trabalhar, irmão. Eles não vão ganhar dinheiro. Nós não precisamos de sindicato, não precisa de ninguém de lá de dentro da mídia, não, pai.
Aí, eu falei pra vocês, os caras tá parando à noite também. Cidade de São Bernardo do Campo foi parada.
Aí, a luta não acabou, rapaziada. Aí, viemos aqui em Mauá fortalecer os caras, certo?
Porque é o seguinte, mano, nós é Ribeirão, nós é Mauá, nós é São Paulo, nós é o caralho, entendeu?
Mano, os bikers dá até orgulho de ver os caras tá fechadão com nós também. Então a gente tem que esquecer, mano, ficar passeando pela rua. A gente tem que pôr a mão no bolso dos caras, mano. Tem que pôr a mão no bolso dos caras. E aí vai sempre. E é isso aí, tem que brincar os restaurantes, mano. E esquece esse bagulho de querer chamar repórter, né? Dá gosto de ver, velho. Dá gosto de ver. Dia 25/7 será o segundo break dos aplicativos nacional. Feita pra quem tem, pra quem tem, pra quem tem. É feita pra quem tem, pra quem tem, pra quem tem.
Yeah, I really recommend if people want to check out their channel. Like they have a page on Instagram with many videos of the strikes, and also there's, I think, an aesthetical sort of like discussion that's interesting. They did an interview with like a cinema journal, which I sent it in the group, but I can send it again, which discusses the sort of like militant cinema that emerged in this, with like the sort of like recollection of material recorded from phones, and just like building this sort of like visual concatenation of video material that's recorded by their own careers, right? And with, I think, but yeah, there weren't many video subtitles, so I just selected two. And yeah, so here's a bit of a summary of that we tell in the text. So there was this first period of connecting the protest, international strike, then the formation of the group I mentioned, the second strike, and then you basically have a sort of like the downfall of this sequence, and then a second cycle. This is, I mean, state of São Paulo I'm talking about, which was, and then this core of careers tried to build a national network, and then this is a period that was one of the most interesting, but I didn't have time to put material, which was this cycle of strikes, which were that like they had this desire to do a strike that lasted more than one day. But I mean, in São Paulo, that was impossible. It was a national strike that was very difficult to coordinate, a more than one day national strike. And in a sense, that only happened for like mid-sized cities. Like, so a city with 10 millions, it couldn't happen. A national strike, it wouldn't happen. Then we got people, like, word started to spread out that there was cities in like small cities close to São Paulo with like 500,000, and that started a strike that went on for like more than 1 week. They completely like shut down all the delivery system of the city for like 7 days. I think there was a city that went up to 11 days. It was really impressive. And then like when one city stopped striking, the next city started. So there was like this thing they did of like passing the sort of like the torch, the Olympic torch of the strike. So the strike continued by just like one city got tired and exhausted, and then they passed to the next city. And this lasted for like more than a month of very intense activity. And in this city, they were successful. Like the company appeared and committed itself, the iFood, come to talk, which was like something really surprising. And I don't know if Victor remember, but they conceded on like saying they would revisit the rates and they would change like the policy of blockade. So they committed in a paper with some of the agenda, and then they stopped the strike. And it was one of the few like concrete sort of like victories of the movement. And
it was the first time the iFood had to officially recognize the strike and negotiated with the strikers. So the first time they promised something, it was around an 80% raise in the basic rate of of delivery, it was 5 reais. It would raise to like 7 reais. That was the verbal promise. And it was significant because before the strike in São José dos Campos, they just ignored the strikes. They did not engage in dialogue or any type of negotiation. So they did not recognize officially that there was a break going on that could actually interrupt the activities of the platform.
Yeah, it's also interesting. Like in this first period, they didn't officially recognize, but I think it was in the day of the second strike. They bought this ad time in Globo. I mean, iFood is the biggest delivery company in Brazil, so they bought the most expensive sort of like time in the TV and made this series of ads. I think it was directed by Fernando Meirelles, maybe, and it was like this series of ads trying to sort of like build a good image of them, coincidentally like in the same week that there was the national strike. So that was their way to acknowledge. They just talked directly to the consumers and ignore the strike. And in the second period, they had to directly sort of like negotiate with them.
Yeah, in 2020, they paid space in various podcasts that were listened by online leftists. They did an ad with Jamila Ribeiro, which is a black theorist that is famous in the web left in Brazil. It was very clear that they were directed at the left, the web left that gave repercussion in Twitter and Facebook and Instagram to the strikes. So I agree with Renzo.
Yeah, and then in São Paulo there was this core group in São Paulo. This progressively also dissolved. It was just like 6 militants with other non-careers, and it just sort of like dissolved in this really conflictual way of many like political and personal conflicts, and people were just like mentally and financially fucked up. Like these careers would stop like one month of work just to like organize a strike, and they tried all sorts of like trying to do like a fund and try to pay like the non-careers and careers, but there was like political division in with respect of who appeared to give interviews, or whether we should talk to politicians or get support of unions. And so there were like different lines, and that it sort of like confounded itself with personal disputes and basically just like exhaustion, just like people were burned out, and this imploded. And then there was this sort of like golpe de graça, like the last, I mean, yeah, but I mean, iFood organized this. They did what the careers were trying to do at the national level, they did for them. They organized like a national forum where they invited representatives and YouTubers and influencers, and like the criteria were like people that participated on protests, like leaders, and also like influencers, like, and they just called everyone and paid like the trip for them to come to like a hotel and do like 3 days of discussions and talks, and at the end they signed a document. And this like was super, I mean, I think at the end it was very I mean,
they signed 2 documents. They signed an NDA,
yeah,
a non-disclosure agreement, and another document with supposed demands that iFood would agree to.
Yeah. And this generated a lot of resentment between careers, because there were the careers that were invited and those that weren't. And those that were invited were like became like either legitimized or treated as like, oh, they conceded, or so there was a lot of fight at that point. So this forum also generated a lot of internal conflicts. And yeah, so the national organization at the end was organized by the very company. So I think this sort of marks the end of the second period. And I guess the third period, that's the way we organize in the text, is just a fragmented ecosystem of these many pieces that were at some point more or less coordinated and unified in a sort of single space. I don't know. I mean, there's also the recent, many of the careers that remain sort of like involved. So many of the non-careers sort of like also got tired, and those that remain, like the careers that remain, started to try different ways to sort of like compromise fighting for their demands, and also sort of making a living out of it. So there was new associations sponsored by politicians and other like sketchy NGOs and all sorts of like ways to get by and compromise these two. I mean, and then, yeah, I don't know if what else has Victor, I don't know how to else to describe this period, but it was like a very fragmented thing that I think it hasn't gone out of it.
I think there's an important detail about something that we shared. I think it was that the main form of political investigation and agitation and networking that we operated were WhatsApp groups. So at first, we entered in the WhatsApp groups that the couriers created and used to learn the ropes of the hustle and to sort of provide security for each other. For example, they would share location. They would share location live when they thought they were going to a dangerous place. So it was sort of a work chat that people would enter to integrate in the culture of the couriers. That it was a big demand because many of these people were not traditional motoboys, couriers. So people were very open they spoke a lot. We learned a lot in these chats, and they were open to interventions. So I think that is important, and I think I would use the chats that we helped create, the more militant chats and the chats you also helped create forums for interstate communication. So we sort of created an informal structure of delegates that would communicate with their base somewhat. And it was a very informal, it changed a lot, but I think I would clearly used this structure that we created and formalized it, choosing the most politically convenient people in these chats. In Goiânia, we created a public organization. It was a bit different from São Paulo because in Goiânia there is a structure that already exists. This is like the ecosystem in São Paulo. In Goiânia, there is a structure that is very important that doesn't exist in São Paulo capital. That is something called families. The couriers, when after some time working for the app, iFood is the main app. It gets 80% of food delivery in the country. They eventually join a family. A family is like a group of couriers that usually deliver at the same place, and they share meals, they play football, they help each other if there's an accident. It's because Goiânia is more rural, and so you have this family thing that is stronger between people here. So they created that, and the organization that was created from the strikes naturally used these families as chains of transmission. So we created a public organization called Revolucionários dos Apps. Apps, revolutionaries. Não fica tão boa. The translation is not very good. But the basis was this family. So it was at the beginning a federation of the families that preferred to participate in the struggle. Acaba que the Instagram was blocked because of some conflict. And so we had a public organization that proposed itself to organize and connect struggles with each other, and it sort of followed the same route as the more informal organization in São Paulo, but okay, pode falar, Gabriel.
Vitor, just a question. The structure of the families of couriers in Goiânia is like the equipe structure, or is it different?
Yeah, it's like the equipe.
But there were more kind of equipes of that sort of groups in Goiânia than there were in São Paulo, you think? Like that's not a culture of courier.
The family is more intimate, I guess. There's a structure of trust that is more.
In São Paulo, you have this a bit of a dissociation. You have like the groups of rolezinho, which are like people that like gather to like ride the bikes and sort of like together in the streets and party. It has this sort of like family thing, but it's dissociated a bit from the groups of work. Like you have the work networks feel to me dissociated from the sort of like more like leisure ones. So you don't get to have this sort of like community structure that was able to be used by the movement to sort of like organize themselves. While in Goiânia, apparently like there's this more sort of like possibility to connect these affinity groups to the sort of like decision, more like high level decision structure that everywhere, I think it's a characteristic everywhere that the couriers are very like solidary to each other in terms of like they organize a lot of small crowdfundings to like help each other, that those that get accidented and are not like covered by the company doesn't do anything, they help each other to like in the WhatsApp groups, they sell stuff. So it's a bit of like a solidarity / work space that appear everywhere, but this kind of like more organization grounded on real territory, I think is this specific composition is very particular to Goiânia, right?
Yeah, and it started help. It helped to think a bit, not only breaks, but what to do between breaks, what to do between strikes. That was something that people were used to thinking about politically, and we thought that maybe that would help diminish the conflict, the personal conflicts and that kind of thing. But when iFood came with an official structure of recognized delegates, they overturned that wasn't an informal structure, but it was a voluntary, like a gift economy structure. It couldn't resist to this economic political structure that iFood provided. So besides having this difference of more or less organized basis, we sort of ended in the same note. So you can continue.
Yeah, and just to give an overview of this ecosystem in São Paulo, like I did a bit like the last presentation. So here's the interior of the movement, the elements that are like inside the movement, and then here's the sort of like boundary of the movement. It's this like elements, parts of the movement that have a bit like 1 feet inside and 1 feet outside. They function as a bit of like an interface with something that is completely exterior to the movement. So here we have like the exterior of it. So I'm calling this is the symbol just for like a boundary. The B being the sort of like body of the movement. So here's the interior of the movement, the boundary of the movement, and the exterior of the movement. So the exterior, you have left consumers, media, companies, and both like new fair companies that appeared, the politicians, and we can divide them in what we call molde, so related to sort of like community, mode B, which is like the state-like forms, and mode C, which is like capital. And you can see that none of these actors can directly interact with day-to-day like careers. They normally interact with the strikers through these interfaces. So the media normally reaches, like for example, Gallo was in a career that was also like a public figure of the movement that was appealed to the left a lot. So the videos here from this channel, this was how like the media managed to sort of like interact of many times, right? While, for example, politicians had to go through, like they normally reach out for like unions to get their opinion, and unions have a limited reach over the workers. Like, so, and again, the companies, the interface that binds the workers, the careers with the companies it's by either like chosen delegates or by sort of like influencers of the movement. And these delegates stay in this complicated position of having to sort of like report to their, so they are normally like people with a lot of like steam in the city, in the region that they work. They're like considered like leaders that are like have not only charisma but like steam, and their steam is always at risk when they interact.
They trusted by
yeah,
the
yeah. They're basically like trusted, and there's this effect that it can happen that when they go outside to like an exterior space, like a meeting with the companies, or they put their trust at risk, right? So they have to always maintain, and they're in this delicate position of being accused of having being sold out. So there's always this tension of having flipped to the other side, either to like the state, being a politician, or becoming sort of like having a contract with the companies. So, which I mean might as well be true, right? So, and in the so also the cooperatives is an element that it exists, but it's very like, I guess there are like some small initiatives of like normally like leftists, like anarchists, like circles, which are operate on a sort of like niche base, but they, as far as I know, they don't have a lot of like influence over like most of the careers. Also, I mentioned this official historical union that's tied to this small subset of workers that actually have a full-time contract, have rights. You have like these new unions, which is, I don't know that much, but it's a sort of like recent phenomena of small associations that try to like dispute the old unions in more like newer terms. And then inside you have all sorts of differentiations, like the motorbikes, the bikes. There was an attempt to sort of like compose with the car, the Uber drivers with car, but it's always hard. There's like a whole space, like whole thing to be said about this weird category inside that's called OL, which are these autonomous workers, which have this modality in iFood where they work like, how do you say, like times, like fixed times, and they work like a full-time worker but without the rights, and they function in this, and they have like a manager, like a direct manager that sort of like disciplinates them. So their adherence, they could be used as sort of like substitute workers in strike days. So there was like tension there also. But I guess this more or less gives you a picture of how many parts there are, and how I think it's useful to stratify the movement like this, and how you can also see how the different parts operate under a specific logic, like a more like community-like logic, a more like contract state-like based logic, and a more like economical logic. I think Gabriel raised the hand.
Yasha can go first. I don't want to monopolize them.
Sure. I'm kind of curious, based on your experience, I guess, like throughout the 3 stages, the dynamics almost of like especially the boundary, and like how, as the movement kind of like grows and has more like public attention, how that kind of like, I guess, like grows the boundary of like interaction almost, right? And whether, I guess, like this point at the end, kind of at the current stage when things are kind of more fractured and maybe parts of the movement were maybe to a degree like co-opted or maybe forced to like take certain lower demands. Like if you think that, I don't know, something about like the growth and the dynamics and interaction between like people internal to the movement, things in the boundary and like the interaction with the exterior kind of has to do with that. If you have any like thoughts, I don't know if that makes sense. Either Renzo or Victor.
Victor, do you want?
Yeah, I think there's like a dynamic that the more time these people in the middle dedicate to external issues, the more they disconnect from the internal tissue. So they at the time there were very many groups, for example, of people that were leaders during a specific strike, and they consolidated themselves as leaders. And 2-3 months later, they didn't know anything about the strike that was going on in their state, city, because they had put themselves in that position. So this interior is very dynamic, and it's not like there is that a certain depuration process of kicking out people that they call politicians or something like that. But there is also, it is very dynamic. The groups are always changing. You have to go from a group to another and earn the trust of people constantly. So, so naturally, new people arise to fulfill these functions, except in the case of influencers like Gallo, who he earned the public outside. So this public always has him in reference of what is going on, but he often didn't know what was going on. People in the strikes had to reach out to him so he would know. But this took some time and effort, and it from both sides. And about the delegates, they usually have to do a lot of work to keep being delegates. That makes it different from usual unions or political representation traditionally. If you want to say something more.
Yeah, I mean, I think is that one useful way is to think about like what's the scope of this mid-level or like delegates or representatives. They act over a sort of like how do you call it, like a landscape that is changes a lot. Like it's people are like moving from different like works to work. So you always have new people incoming, and you have like this. The workforce is proportional to the size of the city, so it's not just like one factory, like a fixed number of factories. So you have like this, and it's not like traditional unions that you like. It's not that like delegates or like important people can just say like let's strike. It doesn't work like that. So you can, for example, gather steam from the media and from the companies, but you in practice you have no necessary power to sort of like make the sort of base strike. So there is always this tension between this very the you say like viração, like this constant refurbishment of the composition of the workers, that it's really hard to sort of like build a more stable thing. On the other hand, it's interesting also how like many of the leaders of the movement were old workers of the careers, which used to earn really well at the time in which like there weren't like the apps. They used to make a good living, and so they are better off, and they had the experience of this sort of like good times and a lifestyle that was more like less precarious. And many of them, like I was close to them, and they changed jobs. Like they started to get like too hard to live with that, so they changed job and continued organizing. So it's interesting, like there was like this subjectivation of wanting to like be a militant and continue to like organize, and at the same time like their reproduction was sort of like bind to something else. So there's this point at which being able to like do the work becomes also like too stressing, and then so there's this always this tension of dissociation between, say, the boundary and the internal, and this kind of dynamics that's related to scale, to composition, and to time, and yeah. So it's
just two questions. The first is, do you have like, I don't want to take up time if you guys have a lot you want to go over yet still. So I don't want to make like, yeah, I can see now it's a very subtle way to say yes. You still need a lot of time. I'm just gonna ask some things and throw it out there, but we don't need to debate it very much now. We can leave it for later, just so I don't take up much time. But I do think that this image is useful to just ask these questions and just point this out, because I wonder if this picture you're showing is really a picture of the ecosystem. I mean, I know that the crucial part here is to show that these things are on the boundary, right? That all these elements are on a boundary position. But I think that there's something about the way that this is laid out here, that when you say there is no connection between what happens here and what happens here, that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, there's either it's a problem of this way of picturing things, or I don't know what, but clearly, you know, for example, if you were to add the national strikes here, the videos, the protests and so on, these are direct connections that bypass, you know, the social influencer, the YouTuber, the delegates, and so on. And so there must be a way of this being presented in this, especially because I think that there is something that, at least intuitively for me, goes the other way around here. And knowing where the text, the direction that the text takes of giving a lot of importance to the effort of like the problem of social reproduction of militant work itself, I have the impression that probably, you know, the structure that connects these things here, this is the thing that makes this an interior, right? So the best way to make the distinction between what's going on in the movement and what's going on outside is actually by having some type of ordering or organizational structure displayed inside here, because otherwise it gives the impression that all the kind of, there's something more amorphous going on here, and then you have these kind of cooptations here that are, you know, types of kind of broader like structurings or things like this, which I think it's a bit deceitful. The other thing that I think that this is useful, this question is useful, just knowing how this would look, it's because clearly all these instances are divided, right? It's not like all app workers are part of the movement. So they are both here and here, right? And possibly here as well. So there are, depending on how you present the ordering here, it will be clear that there's also like a, you know, bike couriers are here, they're also on the boundary and also outside. The difference is that probably when you look at the economical dimension, which is this mode, right? One of the things that, I mean, this is definitely not clear for most people who are here, but one of the things we've been working with, which has been shown to be very useful, is to show that the logic behind what we call mode C is a gradual logic. So you have the inside and you have like a gradual thing towards the outside. The logic of the state is very clear cut. So you have an inside and then you have the outside with no common measure, right? It's either in or out. And the logic of the mode A is a logic where you have the inside, you have like some indeterminate bit, which you don't know if it's inside or outside, and you have the outside, which is also very clearly at stake in these different types of boundary organizations, right? Some of them are meant to be inside, like they're not outside, they're meant to be inside. That's why they're representatives. right? Some of them are negotiating what counts as inside and what counts as outside. They're trying to interpret what's the boundary, where it is, right? And some of them are both inside and outside. They are dealing with the contradiction of, you know, am I inside, am I outside, which is, I mean, the text itself already positions Treta in this exact way, right? Those who were without but were within. So in this little thing, you can already see 3 different types of boundary at stake, which I think is very cool. But that's also why you can describe how the parts of the movement are both inside and outside, which I think it's crucial for what you're showing, right? That it's not all bike riders, not all couriers, and there is actually an inner structure that keeps some of them in the struggle, some of them supporting but not that much, and some of them outside, right? So I have to, like, I don't know, I just miss having a kind of a slightly clearer sense of how we describe like this inner structure, because I think it gives clarity to the other things a bit. But again, I don't think it's something we need to, just wanted to throw it out there for us to debate in the future. I don't want to take too much time with this.
Can I throw out something really fast and reply to that? I agree with Gabriel's basic point here. I think it's definitely true that there is some kind of interconnection between like the internal and the external. Like there's like definitely it has to be some kind of torsion within this graph. Like it's not just what is depicted here. This is actually though exactly where I think mode D would come in, because it's like, you know, you have this implication here where there's a struggle, and then there's this sort of like externality to the struggle, right? You have these different modes that are sort of like part of the capital nation state that implicitly, like whatever the revolutionary energy that might be imminent to the struggle is fighting against, right? If you want to differentiate that dimension of what's happening in the struggle from the other modes, which I feel like is what this is trying to do, I think you have to presume some kind of dimension, which is like what Karatani tries to do with mode D and what we've been trying to do with org as well, which might also be another totally viable way of framing it. I think that would sort of be the internal space, like as something that isn't something you can just collapse into the other 3 modes, but is sort of, you know, its own separate pole to some degree, and it can be analyzed in those terms.
Yeah, I think that this is a great, just to show how great it is that you guys are giving this presentation, because now we have a clear object to ask the question, like, would it be more useful politically, theoretically, to name the inner part of this thing with a logic, like this logic is a different one, or to actually sketch how these different things are combining singularly in there, right? One is like to give it like a big name of free association or whatever. The other would require to actually just stitch together in a non-trivial way. You know, these people are connected with those through reciprocity. Those are connected with those through common economic interest. And the sheathing of it all, right? The gluing of these weird things would be new or not, but right. That I think that's the difference where you would, it situates the problem more clearly now, perhaps.
Yeah, I think we're gonna revisit the modes like soon, so I think we can go back to this. But I think if I understood well, you're saying to try to decompose the sort of like gluing between the parts according to each of the social logics, right? According to the logic,
yeah,
a logic of state and logic of value.
Yeah, I'm just saying that probably, I mean, it's just 2 suggestions for our future work, right? One would be to take into account the fact that, you know, the very logic of having a boundary, like people who are in between the inside of a movement and the general social world, that the very logic of this boundary changes to each of these modes that you're describing, probably. And second, that there is, let's say, a way of describing this interior that is more in tune with the analysis of a cost of organizing, which is a way of describing where you're not simply constructing the inside in terms of a space that you're here, but in terms of, well, this is the kind of little way of connecting things, this kind of, you know, not spontaneous, so costly way of connecting things that we're calling the body of this thing, this way of doing things, right? So for example, the strikes, the families, those are the things that seem to keep the interior together. So probably they should be featured in, a lot of kind of centrality on what we call the interior. And then the motorbikers, the bikers, the logistic organizations, the brekkie, delivery couriers would be connected through these things. So if you keep actively connected to these things, you're in the interior, right? If you have some relation to it, but also with things which are not related to that, then you are in the periphery or the boundary. So I think it would clarify that it costs something to remain inside, rather than suggest something kind of cooptative, like I think that there is exactly as Vito said, right? If you're spending too much time connecting with the outside rather than keeping a certain inner structure, then you might drift away. But then the inner structure is a good thing to keep, as constitutive part of. I mean, it sounds a bit ridiculous to go into this right now. So, but yeah, there's something for us to think for the future when we try to further develop.
Should we move? Was there someone else?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that last picture, really, if there is a thickness to the boundary in this sense, I mean, we're limited by the image, but it's essentially, this is like a mode C perspective, because I think for mode B, the fact that there's only inside or outside means that only the dark circle, the solid circle, is what counts, right? And from mode A, it's not even something we can picture, because it has that torsion thing that Anna was talking about, and which is also why I think the discussion about mode D as a return of mode A in a higher form, it has some interesting topological interpretation there, right? If that indeterminate state, it's not the same as in mode C, right? Mode C, you can almost think of it as like, from mode C's perspective, the inside circle it's the work that's done that's not compensated, because you're striking, you're putting your livelihood at stake, because you're not being paid for your work to organize. And then these YouTubers and more prominent people they're kind of profiting from this work. Like, just considering mode C alone, right? It's like basically you have concentric zones of opportunism. Let's say, like, the closer you are to the center, the least opportunistic you are, because you're doing work for free. And then as you kind of come out to the outside, you're making more money from it. You're making making a name for yourself or whatever. So that's I feel like this picture, it's already kind of a mode C picture. Mode A we cannot picture at all, and mode B, it would just be the solid line. So like YouTubers and delegates, they would just be outside. Yeah, that's mine.
Mode A we can picture as a Klein bottle. And sorry, this is so nerdy. Okay, so sorry.
So yeah, I'll just quickly point out some emphasis of the movement that, I mean, we already discussed many of them, but we will go back to them also later. But I just wanted to mention what appeared. So the scaling thing that we mentioned already, the social reproduction of the striking career, it's every time you're striking, you're losing money, and you can see it's like a very individual thing you feel. It's not like there's no type of worker that's losing together with you. It's just you and the handful that are striking that are losing. This is felt because of the ways also that people are in debt to I mean, there are many conditions, social historical conditions that I guess condition this kind of problem. but it was a movement that was particularly like felt, like the way this cost of participating movements. So the cost of lasting a strike for more than 1 day is a lot. Like people have debts and they have to like 1 week without working is like a lot in this kind of like, there's no like monthly salary that you can sort of like claim later or something like that. It all depends on like striking funds and a lot of like sacrifice. In any case, the third point, which was also an impasse, is this that we discussed. I also mentioned this problem of how you keep a certain distance from these places that are sort of outside, and this tension was explored a lot. Like I just came up with, I mean, what I'm calling autonomous ideology. On one hand, you have the sort of like structure of the market that sort of produce this sort of picture of the world in which you have to get by, you're by yourself, there's this entrepreneurial thing that, I mean, everyone talks about, but it was explored. What's interesting was we attempted to explore that politically in the idea of affirming like a real autonomy, like was a sort of like, the way I see it is like this sort of like autonomist hypothesis that the Italians like had, and others like it was an attempt to like wager that something of this entrepreneurial subjectivity can also function in a sort of like affirmative political way of creating real autonomy, or like what they call like unity without unions, and this kind of, and I mean, it didn't work. Like it was, yeah. But I think it's interesting, like the challenges of that, and yeah, the problem of like coming up with stay-like forms in this kind of like dynamic workspace. Yeah. So now we're getting a bit closer to the text. I think in the text we start the text discussing this sort of like situation in which how we're writing a long time later, we're like fewer, we're not like careers. So the people who normally like elaborate on are like different, like are less and are others, right? And this sort of like, so you have like this active phase of the struggle, and again, this sort of like decoupling, which is very, happens in different ways, I think, but you normally end up with this space once like the sort of like struggle ebbs, you have someone that sort of elaborates. It could be careers, but they are not the careers that were like enmeshed in the strikes. It could be like academics, it could be like militants that are teachers, but you know, when you find this, we found ourselves in this place of like elaborating and trying to like both gather the fragments in both like people who remained and which ones are still wanting, even if we failed, like why are we want to continue. So there's this appearance of this decoupling of what thinks and what sort of like just remains on being social, that remains like in this sort of like social space, which are workers, the workplace, home, etc. And then you suddenly have this sort of external relation between something that thinks about and something that fragments that are gathered. This duality, I think if you push it, like you find like, that's one of the things we're saying, that like two models of militancy sort of like spring out of that. And you can also argue that this is not also temporal. You can also find it like organizationally, like right, the idea of vanguard, etc. So the sort of duality in which you have like a pole that does the thinking, that makes the movement intelligible, a pole that is just like a social composition, and a pole, and then you have like this external interaction between militants and workers. And we argue that you have basically two models that are sort of like mirror one of the other. You have like this more Leninist-like vision, in which like this militants are the ones that sort of like find the right line, the right thing to do, and this are a vanguard, and etc., etc. And then you have counter image of that, like a dual thing, which is a more autonomist sort of like strain of political thought, which tries to the militant is sort of like you're just sort of like receiving a content that's already latent in the composition. You're just like trying to bring it out, but you're not sort of like giving form from above. But we sort of argue that these two schemes share common properties, and we could like label them as so on one hand you have sort of like militancy as intervention, which means militants acting on workers, and the militancy as reception, which are like workers acting on militants. They give form to the struggle, while on the other hand is the militant that gives form to the workers. I mean, they are both like deterministic in the sense that you're either a militant or a worker. There's like a clear sense in which there's no like remainder out of the separation. You have is a directional conceptions, like polity is in a directed flow from one term to the other, and it's all often violently reversed, right? So you can flip the two currents, sort of like are very divisive. And third, you're comparing like heterogeneous terms, right? The worker is conceived as a material pole, and the militant is this non-material. Either it's ideal or it's like some sort of like epiphenomenal, like you can end up saying autonomy is just being this passive sort of like witness of the self-autonomy of the workers and etc. So what we propose in the text is to conceive the militant work as a sort of like intercourse or exchange between homogeneous parts. So you either look from the point of view of this social parts which interact, and something that exceeds this interaction is what we can call political work. So whatever is not determined by the sort of like social form of work and the state and all these determinations, what exceeds is something that we can call political work. And on the other hand, if we treat ourselves like militants interacting and doing like important for the struggle and whatnot, what gets exchanged often is something very ordinary and you know, like necessary and trivial, like, you know, like writing texts and like making meetings and like solving problems, all things that it's ordinary and have value and appears as this social thing. So, and often all these notions of being co-opted or like selling yourself is normally like when this political relation, there's something that's sort of like reincorporated in the social world. And I just like played with the words from Badiou, but here we have like this tree of work and waste, but you have these three opposite properties, right? In determination, the social relation between workers can produce contingent, exceptional political residuals. The political relation between militants necessarily and ordinarily depends on the social underpin. It's an intercourse, not a unidirectional thing. So it's an exchange between workers that produces new compositions, or militants is a social exchange between militants that rely on already existing compositions and relations. And it's an homogeneous intercourse, right? Either you're like treat everyone as workers, or we're all militants, and you can more or less switch between these dual perspectives. And I think this is compatible with like, this is like one of the, for people who are new, like this is one of the main like diagrams that we call it organizational Trinitarianism. So if you notice like these three terms, intelligibility, interaction, composition, they have like different locations and substrates, right? Are these sort of like treat them as three different perspectives of a single like part, if that makes sense. So you can observe a certain situation from what is able to represent, so what this makes intelligible. You can picture, look at the situation and ask what are the parts, like we did, and you can also like ask how they interact. So there's no point like this sort of like reification of these three terms into like this sort of dual thing. So I think that's good. And this is a node slide. Like I'm just trying to map like more like traditional terms from like political grammar back to this triad. So like tactics, it's related to interaction, like what actions can produce new effects and overcome the movement impasses. What places it can produce, like given a certain composition, what it can build of new, like what it can get to represent. So I put some examples from the careers just to give a feeling of how it's sort of like grammar, but it's basically this perspective that tries to like organizationally analyze a certain situation without like assuming what is political and what is not, like where are the militants, what's the ideology, what is the like, where's the left and where's the right. It's just like try to map out like what things are composed and what sort of effects it does to understand what is politically this situation about. Yeah, I'm trying to go a bit fast because of I don't know if we're going to try to finish this today, but yeah, I'm going to skip that. Yeah, should we stop for questions or should we go on?
I think
because we're getting to the modes discussions.
Yeah, I think that it's perhaps it's a good idea just to make a decision over. I mean, I think finishing everything is going to be a pity if you try to do it all at once, because probably, I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't divide it into more than one presentation to keep with the tradition of your presentations.
One becomes two.
One becomes two, exactly. But just to just find a good cut that, you know, you feel like you guys feel like you covered something satisfying for you, but also leaves time for us perhaps to discuss things in more detail.
Yeah, Victor, what do you think is a good place to try to get?
I think we can.
We can definitely get into it.
We can go to the political economy of militants in communism. Then we jump to the Badiou, and you present the thing about defeat and failure another time, because it is something important in itself. And
yeah,
I think
just a second, I have to just give me a second. But yeah, I would suggest we can go cover this and then leave also this.
I just want to say that I'm required to write a blog entry about this meeting, not about the two meetings, right? Someone else will be in the lottery for the next one.
Yeah, this meeting definitely set a high bar for.
Yeah, fuck.
Could you guys also send these slides to the group chat? Like the WhatsApp, or like put them on the website or something.
Sorry, I was talking. Yeah, I sent it in the chat. I can send it on WhatsApp later. I missed what did you decide?
I mean, you guys need to decide.
Yeah, we have a second meeting, but maybe we can, this final part, we finish with the political economy of militants in communism, and then we go to the defeat and failure and the Badiou in the next.
Okay, so okay. Yeah, so it shouldn't take that much. Yeah, I think we can make it in not too long. Right. So yeah, this last section for today is trying to do like what we were discussing before. I'm just gonna go through I think there are many new people here. So this is like a thing we got from Karatani, which is this Marxist philosopher that wrote this book called Structure of World History, I think. And he proposes that you can analyze like social formations by picturing it as a mixture of 3 different social logics. So instead of like analyzing everything from the point of view of capital, or everything from the point of view of like state or from like communities, he says these 3 logics are irreducible one to each other, and you need always to sort of like analyze the right mixture. So the modern form of these 3 logics is the nation for mode A, what he calls mode A, which is the logic of affinity and of gift giving that structures like communities. The modern form of this mode B, which is the logic of contracts, in which you dominate someone and you receive protection on the other side, or this sort of like asymmetric relation. The modern form is the state. So you have contracts, taxes, law, repression, while for like the nation, you have like identities, communities, culture. And mode C is basically the logic of commodity exchange, or like exchanges of equivalent, which is the logic of value. And the modern form is, of course, capital, which is, and for him, like capitalism is basically a mixture of these 3 things where mode C is dominant. So in other periods of history, like mode B was dominant when there were like empires, and a long time ago, like mode A was dominant, in which like societies were structured from gift giving sort of like structures. So here what you exchange is the gift and the counter gift, and it has this sort of like, formally has this sort of like contradictory sort of like thing in which things can be inside and outside. You can have like things that are true and false at the same time. Like you can, while the logic of contracts is more classical, you're either like are dominated or you're like subdued. You either like do like firm like a contract or you don't. And the logic of value is more like intuitionistic, which means that you have like a continuous sort of like parameter of values, like you can exchange more or less a certain commodity. So you have like 3 different logics with 3 different like structures. And what we're saying, I think, is that, okay, the social world can be decomposed in like these 3 things: capital, nation, state. But we're saying that there is a larger point of view, and this is the communist hypothesis, a larger space of organizations in which these 3 logics can be composed, which is richer, meaning it includes all these constraints, but it's a richer space in which you can do more. So more stuff can exist in these spaces of all organizations possible, which is still a composition of at least 3 modes. So you would have, so this general form, which is not capital, nation, state, I'm just calling like value structures, affinity structures, and protocols, so that we don't picture like the state when you talk about protocols. We don't think about like nations and identities when we talk about affinity, and it's not necessarily capital when you talk about value. Like it can be structures of like dividing income and rent and sort of like creating all sorts of like financial structures that doesn't accumulate into that doesn't produce capital. Okay, so if this is true, that means that we can analyze also like political movements, which are sort of like exceptions to the social world, which are not contained in the capitalist world, also with this sort of grammar, which should be more general, if the communist hypothesis is true, right? So you can talk about like stuff that is new, still using like a logic that we can sort of like a grammar that we more or less know how it works. So an example here, if here is a scheme, like again, this is the interior of the movement, the boundary of the movement, and the sort of capitalist world with a K. So this scheme we will go back later on, so you can ignore it a bit. But here, so if you see this triangle, you have like A, B, and C. And I put like a legend here, so you can see. This is an attempt to sort of like decompose the career movement into these 3 logics. So A, B, and C, it's mixtures. And looking from the point of view of the reproduction of the movement, and looking from the point of view of what we're calling production of the struggle, like in the sense, production in the specific sense of producing effects, like recomposing the capitalist world and consuming it back, like start using it for political effects, and the more internal sort of like reproduction of the movement itself. So if this makes sense, like, so here in the interior, you have like strike funds, which is sort of like a value structure of mode C. You have the networks of careers that try to, the national level, that try to form this sort of like almost state power, like a space of this decision of the movement. And here the sort of what we were talking about, like the families, the sort of like motorboy solidarity, the sort of spontaneous sort of like leisure sort of like parades. It's all like affinity like logic. And then you can find also like mixtures of that, like the frontline careers, which has esteem in their communities, but also are a sort of delegate in a larger power structure. You have cooperatives that manage value, but they still depend on like contracts from the state. You have, and I mean, as I said, it wasn't too integrated in the movement, but I think it could be. The small like crowdfunding, which depended on knowing the person or like trusting what was being done. It's not like this more like abstract sort of like fund. And on the other side, you have like the parts that are responsible of producing action in like the companies, in the apps, in the state. It's driven towards the outside of the movement, right? So you have the strike, which is targeting like the revenue of the app. You have an external attempt to like form like an external like power structure, again, the network. You have the solidarity that emerged in action, like in the blockades. You have the strike assemblies and the user campaigns that I meant that depended a bit on like solidarity or like, and also on like giving up your money. So the idea is that these different sort of like logics, all you cannot just say like you're a party, you believe in like party politics, or I mean you can say that, but or you're just doing classist politics. As a matter of fact, like often these other logics appear in concrete situations and political movements and appear in mixed ways. So the question is more like how you compose them and understand what they do. And I think also thinking what is relevant for reproduction and what's relevant to produce effects, like often like you can get lost in both dimensions, right? You can sacrifice yourself to like produce so many to like have like spectacular and concrete damage to their companies at the cost of undermining your own reproduction. On the other hand, you can get just like caught up in organizing, you know, like cooperatives and funds and networks, and it has no effect like concrete to the capitalist world. It's just like enclose yourself in your own reproduction. So you can, if you dissociate, if you dissociate and try to just like focus on this boundary, or I think that's at least one of the theses here. Like if you just think about the interior, you can become disconnected, and then the political dimension of your movement can get lost. And at the same time, if you just think at the boundary, and forget the reproduction dimension, you won't have energy to like just go on. And here is just a scheme with like the capital, like the world is also structured. So the reaction towards this. So as we talk, like the concessions, monetary concessions, the punishment given by the algorithm, which is like a state-like thing, the cooptation of leaders, the iFood forum, which was like the structure that got representatives, right? The marketing campaigns that they did, which is also this appeal to the users, to the community, the leftist consumers that cost money, and so on. So So you start to get like more and more structures, we hope, as you try to like decompose the situation with this. And this is a sort of like summary where we probably can stop and discuss, which is like a master. Yeah, we don't have to look. It's so given all these point of views. So we talked about like the point of view of each one of the modes. You can think about like a specific political work that you do that's related to that. Like it was very impressive, like how much time we just spent managing personal conflicts and like solving like people that are like breaking down or like are just like pissed out at each other. It has like this sort of like like community sort of like management thing. At the same time, there was this whole like infrastructure of communication given by the WhatsApp groups, like setting up meetings. There's a lot of political work with sort of like logistical maintenance and creation of networks that's sort of like indifferent to the community that you're dealing with. And there's also like this financial structures, like organizing a strike fund. So you have these 3 dimensions of militant work. So militant work is not defined here in terms of like being a left, like some essence towards being a leftist. It's like there's more sort of like ordinary, that's you actually describing what you spend your time on. At the same time, you want to be concerned on what this does organizationally, right? So that's where the organizational trinitarianism comes. So from the point of view of intelligibility, it's what I call a cartographical dimension. You try to constantly map the new parts that appear in the movement. So the videos was like a clear thing that did that sort of like represented the movement to itself. So more than going to the media, like those videos that I showed, they were like a very important tool to sort of like represent the movement to itself. Like the movement, if you're in this strike or working, you have to know like what's happening. And that's the sort of like cartographical function is what was done by videos and this kind of production. The more compositional work, which is trying to bind heterogeneous components, like coordinating the bike and the car protests, coordinating like once we did try to like coordinate like a teacher's protest with a career protest. So you have different parts that before don't have like a common part, and then we try to like find something that connects them, like find a common thing that could compose them together. And another like dimension is like always trying to come up with different ways to like act and do stuff. So with different tactics. And yeah, so you can always like see how all these spheres are normally dimensions are at work in like militant practice, right? And yeah, you want to add something?
Yes, can I just think it's important to think, I think in both our experiences, Renzo, if you think this social intercourse trinitarianism, we invested a lot. I think our political tradition moved us toward that, maybe, in affinity in managing personal conflicts, both in the revolucionários experience and the linha de frente experience. And we sort of didn't pay much attention to the logistical and financial work. So that was where I invested. And it's interesting because since we invested so much in affinity, what was logistical and financial appeared as personal, because we did not need to care about losing money because we are rich boys, whatever, and we were trying to be the like the coordinator, the bosses of the movement. And since that wasn't something that was worked out, I think it's important to think how it relates to the failure and defeats we had. I think this is a useful thing to produce, because it allows us to see what exactly we are doing, what we weren't doing, and since we weren't doing, it was done for us. I think I don't know if I agree with this assessment, but you can go on. Just I thought it was something I would forget if I didn't say it right.
Yeah, I remember we discussed how like autonomism is, I think it's something like I put here in the, I think it's related to what you're saying. Yeah, this culture of struggle and war, right? It's interesting how like, I mean, the traditions that were more like formed, it treats many problems as like, because it hates the state and capital, like everything becomes a matter of like, almost like a cultural problem, like finding like the right image, like doing the, like trying to like transmit this sort of like meme of politics, right? But it has technological limitations, like people change and stuff, like people move on, and culture is, this kind of like political culture is really hard to maintain. I mean, it's already hard to maintain in general, but like imagining this kind of like workspace in which like things are like so fast and doesn't stick, like it's just like the constant recycling of whatever is composed. And that's where like, and the same can be said of like other traditions in which you try to like, okay, no, we have to like create a new union, and then you're just like obsessed with like having like the right structure, juridical structure, and then suddenly you have no connection at all to like the careers anymore, like no one cares. But maybe like the state pay attention to you, but and so on. Like you have the cooperatives that appeared, like you have these new fair apps, which are also some attempts to like solve it, but you get the same problems, right? Of just like, you're just like a value structure, and you normally like operate for like a niche of leftist consumers. The few cooperatives that I've seen there, they have this problem of like relating to the general like workforce and having like some form of like political structure. Like I think there's one initiative in sort of it was like some city that was testing the government, the prefecture was testing like a state cooperative. I don't know how that went, but yeah, you have this, you often like when you're in the ebb of the movement, it's interesting how you find like the pure forms of the modes. Like normally like people just like, yeah, we should go harder on just like we shouldn't have like talked to the union, or the opposite, like we got too lost on. So I think there's also like a side effect of the idea of the elaboration being done at the downfall, right? Because you see this pure forms, political forms consolidating that doesn't reflect what was the complexity of the situation. I don't know if that makes sense.
Can I just ask something? I mean, again, not sure how we would further develop it now, though I think that this double image you guys propose here in this idea of looking at militancy as intercourse, it's interesting because one way is to think of this as a sort of kind of right, what happens in between, but you can also just think of it as the name of as I think actually what you guys were proposing, just think of militancy in this case as the name of this type of interaction, right? So let's say if you have a non-trivial interaction between workers, in the sense that it's not just going to happen spontaneously due to economic, communitarian, state connections, so people are therefore connecting politically because they're not just connecting due to the kind of everyday current of their lives. That connection, so it's a relational definition of militancy rather than kind of a positional or a identity of somebody. Whereas there's something interesting in saying that the relation between militants, so the moment that you try to actually connect people who are politically engaged, that the name of that connection is a type of social intercourse, which seems to imply that you're going to be able to analyze it by considering these different modes, right? So this thing here, you won't be able to consider if you don't include something political into the picture. but you also won't be able to understand what's going on between militants if you don't add something social in the sense of issues of status, labor, prestige, gender, race, etc. Right? Which then begs the question of, isn't it interesting to imagine, how this relation affects this identity and how this relation affects this identity, right? It almost seems to me that this, I mean, the category theorists here can see, like, you have the first the map, now you have the maps between the maps and so on. Might be interesting to think how much, if these things are blocked. So I'm just trying to riff off what Vitor said, that something was done for the militants in the process of organizing, which I think could come to mean something like this picture of militancy. So this non-trivial way of organizing, that people are organizing amongst each other, which is a relation, didn't become an identity. And this picture of work that appears as a relation doesn't also change the way that this is an identity. Like, there might be, okay, this looks like that crazy meme, but you get my point, that it does seem like there might be some extra level of investigation we could add to this, which is perhaps there is a way to condition how much attention we pay to this. Probably increases the type of kind of sensibility one has to this, right? Whereas the more sensibility we have to this, the sort of immanent stitching together of people through whatever means they need to accomplish a political goal, might also develop new ideas for what it means to be in this position, which I think this is how we get to the, like, this is, let's say, implicit somehow in what you guys are saying with this. Let's look at the hustle of militancy. And it seems like you looked at the hustle of militancy because you took the name that the workers are giving to their militancy, which is connected to the hustle, and you're applying it to the conflict that is already, the name of the group, right? So there is, in the very inversion you proposed, something that seems to have to do with this. And I wonder if, when this is broken, this type of connections, if that's not the moment where, well, this is going to be defined by the counter movement you guys define. So if you don't have a way to connect this to this, well, the work of militants is just going to be described as a mixture of A, B, and C, right? And if you don't have a way to connect this to this inner militancy of the workers is just going to be kind of removed from that political body. Like, there might be a way of describing a type of crisis in more detailed ways by looking at how the relation of work between militants gets to affect how we understand the struggle of workers, and how the militancy between workers gets to affect how militants see themselves. It sounded much clearer in my mind.
It was clear to me.
Yeah, to me it was
awesome.
Yeah.
If I could jump in with something, this is actually where, like, Gabriel will probably be frustrated with me making this philosophical, but the one concept here that I really like, that I feel like actually connects really closely with what he's saying about how one of the things that, or like the thing that tends to undermine how actually both sides of these could still function as like Bedouin work rather than waste. It seems like, when something kind of gets stopped up or like prevented from articulating with like its externality or extimacy or whatever, however you want to frame it. Tristan Garcia has a really cool concept of like compactness, which I feel like is actually really helpful here, where like what he tends to define as compact is like precisely the kind of thing that really just goes in a circle around itself, sort of like how Badiou characterizes like, the difference between dialectical idealism and materialism, where dialectical idealism is kind of just going in a circle and materialism would be a spiral, right? So that's one of the reasons why I think for all of his other flaws, Tristan Garcia is actually really useful here, because I think that concept is sort of a little bit more of like maybe a generic way of looking at like that kind of blockage, or like identifying it on multiple different levels.
I think Victor wanted to speak.
No, it's just because I remember the situation in the Revolutionaries experience that there were more people who produce videos and social network management, and there was a moment when the couriers didn't want to discuss something politically important for my colleagues, and they sort of did a strike. They refused to produce videos and do posts until that was discussed in the group. And that was very weird for me, because people said that we are comrades, so we were workers who were helping other workers. And but at some moment, my friend described what he was doing as a strike against a boss, or someone trying to be his boss, and at the same time we were trying to direct politically what other people were doing. So who was the boss? It was something very weird, uh, but I think hearing Gabriel, I thought about this. I think we did not really clear things about what we were doing. What was it? Work? Was it militancy? What's the difference between these things? We sort of refused to put the question to the collective. What were we doing there? And that gave rise to various situations like that, where people are either trying to boss around each other, or like enfim, or the opposite, né? We were trying to exchange our services for a political line. I think we did this more directly than the people of Treta, because the Treta channel didn't have this individual relationship with the couriers organization. It was different, their exchange. But I think our experience clears a bit some contradictions of this relationship, because I think these circles, they are equal here in the diagram, but sometimes there was more militance in one side and more workerism in another side. In the side that I think, I'm not sure if this applies to Treta, but I think we emphasize the worker identity of the couriers, while we had the role of trying to maintain a political radicality in the movement. So it was a asymmetrical relationship, I think, in this sense.
Yeah, I remember it reminded me a bit of, yeah, I think it's possible that there was this difference between São Paulo and Goiânia in the sense of the militants, like the non-career militants treating themselves more of a service, like of a social function within an organization of careers, which is something like I've heard in like EWGB in England. Like when they started to like pay organizers to do work, they were like this independent union in England, and at some point, and founded by like it's like the president, like the leaders are like careers and cleaning like staff, and then they started to like pay organizers, and the organizer I spoke to, like he said that the sort of like more classical political work of organizing, it was treated like a strict like job, like he was like had like tasks to do and like an hour to be paid. So it was in a sense almost like this function of militancy was controlled by being treated as a sort of like ordinary work, while the politics was going out by the fact that they were trying to like compose different sectors. I don't know, it just reminded me a bit while in my experience in São Paulo, like there was always this sort of an anxiety of like, are the careers militants, or are we militant non-careers? What are we for them? And then there was like, in a sense, an attempt to sort of like fuse these two things, and this experience of like the career becoming like a militant, in the sense of I'm doing this not because I'm just like working, there's like something I want to continue. It produced a lot of like, yeah, it led to different problems, like of how you can subjectivize these notions, and on the other side, like the non-careers militants feeling that you become just like a freelance consultant for like struggles. So I mean, I think being at peace with that was something that I think maybe in Goiânia they did that was good. But yeah, I think there's this dual, the way I see, like what Gabriel was saying, is I see these two pictures as sort of like this dual perspectives that you have to be able to keep, like if you're not able to switch, if you're not able to synthesize like these two perspectives, like if you cannot like find the sort of like political work that is done between workers, and you just like do political work like sort of blindly, it tends to become like regular just work. And the opposite is also true. If you try to like fool yourself too much into think you're doing political work, you enter into like ordinary social as dimensions, like you sacrifice yourself for the cause. You just like, there's like a social logic to it. It's not like just the idea of something. So I think the way I see it is like this dual perspective that helps you keep your one foot in the ground and the other sort of like oriented towards like a political idea. So yeah, and I think it's not possible to see these two perspectives at the same side. So there's a way to keep out this sort of like tension, is to say that these two perspectives are not like, they are dual things. One is the reverse of the others. If other people that are new here want to speak,
I think Raviv has his hand up.
Good. Okay.
Hi, yeah, I'm Raviv. This is my first session, as I mentioned, so I'm seeing like all of this with very little context, and a lot of it is blowing my mind, and it's also reminding me of some other areas of mathematics that I used to study, and I was just curious if this whole model of boundaries and interiors and exteriors as applying to what it strikes me are essentially social networks. If you've looked into it all, like the field of network science, or the theory of, not necessarily like topological graph theory or something, but the more applied field of network science, because there are tools in that, from what I remember, to do things like devise like probabilistic models on networks like these, or do things to determine, for instance, an optimal configuration of relations between nodes in a given network to maximize like certain groups or communities within the network you have. And I, to be honest, it's a field that I haven't looked at in a while, but I was just curious if that had, I don't know if anyone had thought about that, or if that was something that you looked into at all. Yeah, it could be that it's not applicable at all, but I just thought I'd mention it. I have a PDF of a textbook if anyone's interested. And I was looking at, just while you were talking, like some of the chapters in it. There's one chapter that might be relevant, but I'm not really sure.
Yeah, can you send it on the chat? That sounds cool.
Nothing puts people here on a spiral like saying you have a textbook of a completely obscure and undecipherable area of mathematics that we don't understand.
Well, I mean, look, it's simpler than category theory. I'll give you, it's mostly just going to be probability and calculus. But if anyone's interested, I don't know if I can put a PDF in the chat or anything, but
yeah, I think you can. Yeah, I think it works. But I think you can also share it on. Yeah. I think it accepts files here if you want.
To maybe semi-address Review's question, I do think something like that would be like applicable, maybe like in the case of something like our theory actually finding some like success where we can maybe be a little bit more empirical about it. So I think a lot of the reason why we lean a little bit more abstract is just more to like name the terms and like trot out the space and the I guess like logical relations between
yeah, totally.
Yeah, but no, that's definitely a great reference.
Well, one thing I was thinking as I was having these ideas was that definitely you'd need to do, I think, maybe a more, like you said, a more concrete formulation of some of these things, which you would lose something in doing that as well, certainly, you know. But I don't know what that would be off the top of my head. These are all just kind of ideas. I don't know. I just like thinking about.
Yeah, but I think you touch on a really important point that
especially when it comes to digital communication technology, you know, there are ways in which these networks can literally be implemented. So
yeah, but you know, I think that you touch on a really cool point, because at first I was very worried about this, that I mean, there are clearly, you know, more applicable sides of these formalisms and mathematics you could be looking into rather than this very kind of generalized abstract parts of it. But these days I think that it's interesting to see that there is actually a, let's say, a healthy counterpart to this, because I think it would be quickly a much better framework if we were, for example, inside a process analyzing it as it's happening. So the same way that this is applied topology and graph theory in some sense, it almost mirrors the fact that when you're describing, like when you're already going into the touchy subject of describing general structures for something that is so singular when it does happen, you know, every political process is different and should be treated differently rather than just generalized. So weirdly enough, when you deal with these very abstract structures, you end up protecting, kind of preserving the difference on the ground, because you still need to go on the ground to look at things to get a feel for what they actually are like. So you just have better tools to do it. So I think focusing on these abstract structures has the weird political merit of not saying too much about the concrete aspects, meaning it kind of motivates you to look for the concrete properties on site, right, on the actual struggle. And then you need to see what actual tools you need. So if you do need in that particular movement, for example, to get a better picture and a better understanding of your online presence and how people are moving and analyzing data from, you know, from how social networks are being used, for example, clearly these other tools will be better, but you will also have more resources perhaps to not fall prey to some assumptions, because, for example, the concept of connection in network theory is very underdetermined. It just implies any type of connection depending on the substrate that is at stake. So, you know, likes on a network or people who exchange messages and so on. If you start from this broader thing, and I think that the idea of boundary that we were just talking about just now, and showing that what a boundary is changes depending on the organizational stakes, the logics at stake there. So you could look at a graph or a network, and it will be impossible to see just by looking at the distribution of nodes, for example, and the stronger hubs and things like this. If you're looking at something that is organized more as a kind of gift-like economy, if it's organized more like a state-like structure, or if it has this kind of intuitionistic thing. Like you might not be able to tell those things apart because it's kind of a question that you should be asking yourself before, you know? So though we haven't worked that out very well, and I think that we should, as principle, look into everything, you know? I think I have the intuition that it might end up mapping nicely into the things you would probably like to discuss in the abstract, in the sense that they are probably interesting questions in a broader scope, and the questions that are applied in the sense of you would want to develop those under specific conditions of specific processes and not generalize them too much, you know? So knowing like things like, well, we know of a certain number of social logics, they seem to have specific distinct qualities, and you can look at things from the perspective of how these things connect. That's saying a lot, but not saying everything. You still will need to, you know, discuss very precisely each process to be able to understand how in that process these things were mixed together, right? So there might be some interesting analogy between pure and applied in that sense. But I'm not sure. I think that, especially after reading, I'm not sure if you read Rodrigo Nunes' book on theory of organization, which uses a lot of network theory.
Right. It's definitely a field that has been both abused and used. But I also recognize that I think what I was talking about and what this is they're clearly different projects and doing different things. I was just curious if it was something that you had thought about before.
I think it's a great connection though. And there's potentially a really fertile like interconnection between those two frameworks for sure.
On the question of this, the comment Gabriel made in the beginning of this, I think the next part of the presentation is gonna try to push to the limit this interior boundary exterior thing in terms of what role we can play in for political economy. And I mean, so I'm not sure if this interior boundary, I feel it's still something that that every political movement more or less have, in the sense that like how Badiou says, you have like how you picture like movements, you have like this internal space, and I agree you have to sort of like each social logic the concept of boundary will change, but I feel I'm not sure if you can talk about like a single boundary, unified boundary, or you would have to sort of parse them into different logics. I don't know. I think probably the next part of the presentation will help to sort of like,
you know, what the analogy with biology now is that you're specifying organs, right? So you have sensitive organs, which are like mode C organs, like the eyes are boundaries of a certain type. Right? We're talking about the organic individuation now of the process.
We're preparing even a different monster, like a monster with specialized.
That's the
complex,
the monster. Real complex. But one thing, I mean, I'm not sure if I don't want to monopolize. I'm not sure if anyone wants to ask anything else.
I have one maybe quick thing. This is just like an open question because this is something I don't really know yet. Oh wait, can you go back to the big diagram? Sorry. Just I don't quite know if we have like a good model of maybe like the geometry of the lot of each of the different logics and how they differ, right? Like, so each of these interactions, like we have a kind of an association of different types of logics, but how does that affect like the way that these interactions I guess, interact with or like change the boundary and interior relations, right? I think this is just like something we still, unless others have ideas already, but like how does it make a difference when something happens? And how does it, whether like, I don't know, grow or change maybe a boundary or an interior component in some way when there's an interaction with like the state, for example? But I don't know, this is just like to put it kind of into the ether. I think it's an interesting thing to look into.
I think that would be super exciting to work on more in the future, because it's what came up before when we were first talking about this, right? Like how mode A would be more like a Klein bottle or something, and this is kind of a mode C style graph, whereas like mode B would be sort of more there's an inside and an outside and nothing necessarily really in between. And I am trying to, like, I know this has been a point of contention in the group, but I have been trying to think about like other ways potentially to represent mode D2. So that's definitely something I'm going to be pursuing this year, and hopefully there'll be something that at least comes with that in terms of a conversation.
Yeah, I think this brings, I mean, I had a very concrete question that leads to the ridiculously speculative one, because it seemed to me, I mean, I agree that when you look at this picture, actually, I don't think the picture is mode C necessarily. It's just because every line has a thickness, therefore every picture is intuitionistic. So yes, you know, it is more like a gradient thing than a clear cut or whatever. You could, I mean, I don't think there's any problem formally to represent these things. They don't need to look visually like anything to be formally represented, right? But what I did think that, I mean, I remember a conversation, I think we were drunk perhaps, Renzo, but we were talking about representation in movements and how to think about representation and strategies for representation not to become kind of pulled apart from the thing being represented. And I remember this was also a discussion we had when you constructed the similar image to describe the students' occupations. And we also had like an idea of this ecosystem, right? And we were also talking about at that time how the certain student bodies became more advanced, their role in articulating demands and things like this. And I was very struck by how Victor presented, you and Victor both, the movement from the period 1 to the period 2 of the courier strikes. Because the first point was that, the first thing you guys said was, well, in the first period, there was no interlocution with the couriers, between iFood and the couriers. So they were indirectly responding, so putting ads on TV and so on, but not directly engaging. So it was more, there was no direct contact in that sense. There was just economic contact due to intervention and so on, but no like, okay, who represents the movement? And then in the second moment, there were direct negotiations, ultimately leading to the creation of a forum that is already something sponsored by iFood and that has a kind of critical effect on the movement, right? And then the third period, we get dispersion with small little representatives, like the politicians who sponsor new associations, right? And so this is the first level, that there is like a story of the first, second, and third period that has a lot to do with how representation appears. And I wanted to hear you guys a bit more on the second moment, when direct negotiations require somebody to show up and speak. And therefore, how is this representative produced, right? And Vitor gave a clue that was interesting when he said that you guys first got into the movement through the WhatsApp groups that were meant to instruct workers on their day-to-day basis, which I mean is a great example of workers plus workers producing like a militant surplus, right? But then a group that was created for the militancy to directly interact, and that WhatsApp group was the one that had like a work surplus that could be appropriated by a state to kind of set up its own forum, right? So so one thing I wanted to hear was about representation and how these representatives appear, if they did, how I remember there were some strategies to try to keep this kind of inside the movement and not create like figures that would represent everything. But I also think that it's interesting to look at this problem of representation from the standpoint of these three logics and the boundaries, because the idea of a representative has a bit of that structure, right? That you will take a smaller part, and that smaller part will answer for the whole. It can be one person, a small delegation. And then the question is, what binds the small part to the inside? Is it bound by, you know, it has the power to speak for them, which is a basic authority structure. It is conditioned by them by some level of reciprocity. You know, whatever they do here will get a response, whatever. Is it a different type of connection where I would even say, right, I think that I was trying to think of names for this, like a very classical way of naming this kind of state-like boundary thing is representation, a part that stands for the movement. It looks like in the case of mode A, it's like a small group, a sample of the thing is being presented, but it never gets to be a full representative, right? Otherwise it's cut off. And in mode C, it seems like it's more about the part sets up what counts as an inside and an outside, right? So if a part becomes too autonomous, it's not like it is representing the movement. You're actually defining where the limit is, something like that. So I just wanted to see if you also have some insight how you would think of that, because it seems to me usually those are the two ways that you can try to block the state-like representative function, which is to either pull it back, right? So the moment that the boundary is gonna shrink, because, for example, there is no communitarian relation between, or no reciprocity ties between some delegates and the inside, you can use mode C to make it fuzzy, or you can, right, the moment that is, you can also create communitarian ties to make the boundary indeterminate in that way, that it's more inside than before, something like this. So I just wanted to kind of bring this discussion on representation, because it sounds like it does help to scan the periods and connect those scansions to something that has to do with this logical mechanism, you know?
Yeah, one thing that came to my mind is something that impressed me, like that caught my attention, is that how like throughout like this first period and part of the second, like the sort of like conflicts that appeared were sort of resolved in this kind of power consistent ways. Like people would defend different directions, and the way to resolve that wasn't like the more like traditional militant style of like just like voting or just like finding a consensus or just like finding the right line. Everyone sort of like, my impression was that they sort of tried to find this middle ground in which you sort of like ignored a bit of everyone else's opinion, and sort of like, and for example, if someone messed out, it wasn't like a matter of deciding whether he messed out or not and just like punish him. It was like a bit ignoring that he crossed a bit the line. And so it was this weird, you tolerated a lot of contradiction in order to keep things going. Like one of the rules was like, no negativity is allowed. Like you try to minimize that so that like real decisions appeared. So I think there was this more like communitarian way to manage conflict. And at the second period, when you had to decide, like when it was clear who was invited and who wasn't, then things start to break apart. And so that's one thing I don't have like a positive answer for the second part, like stuff that worked well in this problem of more like state-like structures. Like the idea, again, the idea of the first period was to create the entregadores do break, was to be this sort of like open identity in which anyone could be a career of the break, because you could just like a mask, you know, like it was supposed to be like this open identity that still would sort of like incentivize others. But the moment you have to be called to a meeting, then you become binary again, right? Either you're invited or not. The second thing that came to my mind is from another discussion we had of like that a friend told about how the indigenous movement, like this problem of representation, right? Of how sometimes having the representer being someone different from you and not someone who has something in common to you. So how like for a long time, the indigenous movement in Brazil had like the white anthropologists who were militants for the cause, did the interfacing with the state, and at the state you had also like white people. And that sort of like clarified a bit who was like the white anthropologists were representing them and dealing with other whites. So there was no confusion of like an indigenous sort of like being on the other side or being this sort of like weird position. It was classical in the sense of they're white do the interface and are part of the state. So that clears up any confusion. The interior is indigenous. While in terms of affinity, the white anthropologists are paraconsistent. They have one feet on the white world, on the other feet, they are like comrades of the movement. So I think that's an example, recent example, that sort of like a case in which the representative is someone, by the fact that he's different from you, can actually have like an upper hand on. Like, so now that we have like a leftist government and there are indigenous in the government, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, but it was something that was raised, I've heard, in the indigenous movement. Like they said, like it was easier before if we don't have indigenous in the state, because then it's clear like who are we facing, and the white are supposed to do this kind of like interaction with the state. The problem, the moment you have to get this criteria doesn't work anymore, then it's now tricky how you organize this representative function. And yeah, so I like in the career case, like it's either people got like less sectarian in the sense of like, yeah, it's fine to just like deal with many stuff, it's just the way it is. So there was one line that went this more like pragmatic way and just like accepted that people, and I think that's like you have fit in many stuff, like people are careers, people are get money being an influencer, like you just inhabit many social like spaces and you have to get by. So it's more like, on the other hand, people that were more radical got resented because they tried to actually binarize this, like you were too hybrid, so you're the other side. So I think there was also the way that this ecosystem collapsed was a way of like how this boundary also like got interpreted. Like one side just tried to like make a clear boundary, and we are like more radical and pure, and then the rest is the rest, and then you get resented. And then there were the other ones that said, well, there's no boundary, so like it's all the same, like everything goes. And then also weird stuff started to happen. So I think that's why like being able to precise better these boundaries, it's important, because the way that different groups treat that, interpret and act as the kind of topology that this boundary have, I think, political effects. Yeah, but yeah, so that's as much as I thought.
I think
sorry,
in Goiânia, I think that's an important question. But I think in Goiânia we had something more like a changing protocols. In the first phase and until some time after the forum, we had something of a collective decision system, and that was based on the fact that we all shared somewhat the same risk. So the people who were not careers, we sort of put ourselves to run some risks together with the couriers in the blockades of being like physical, of being physically assaulted or by the police, or being, in my case as a journalist, the company tried to get my bosses to fire me from a freelancer, and that sort of consolidated a collective decision making because we all share the same risk. And that also, we didn't have from the beginning any individual influencers that were very important, unlike São Paulo had Galo and other people. After the forum, it was like slowly the pressure and the decision making was concentrated in one person, in two people who went to the forum, who signed a contract, who had to hear the calls from the company, and they sort of started saying, we will lose our jobs and you won't. And after time, more and more people began to be in direct contact with iFood. And so they would also start saying that if we do something radical, we may lose our jobs and you won't. So that kind of recreated the separation between the militants and the workers, in some sense. At the same time that the workers were taking the functions that were traditionally left to the non-workers militants, like talking to the company, negotiating, and that kind of stuff Reza said about the white anthropologists. So after some time, when politicians and the company finally decided to interfere more in the movement, they already had a channel that was one directional. We thought we could do a bidirectional interaction with the company. We would pressure them and they would pressure us, but in the end, the company had more resources and power to force changes in the group, and we didn't think properly how to respond to their power. And in the end, it ended the same way. We fragmented, and now it's sort of disconnected with the dynamic of producing struggle. The group began to live by itself. For example, we also had this thing of identity. Anyone could be a revolucionário dos apps. After the forum, we produce t-shirts, and some other people tried to produce t-shirts using the same model, and we didn't let them. So we stopped being like a forum for the families and sort of became a family, a brand that had to protect itself. So it's not like a problem exactly of representation in the sense of choosing representatives and their connection to the group, but a problem of representation, I think, like, what are we? And what is our relationship with the other workers who are not we? I think that's sort of the problem that arose, and in the end, the company had more influence than the dynamic of economic struggle against the company.
Thanks, man. That made a lot of sense.
Should we maybe leave for the next? Or does anyone wants to?
Just a practical question then. Probably it would be a good idea. I mean, we had a meeting scheduled for next time, but since the students don't want to meet now, they want to wait a couple of weeks, I can just postpone that meeting a week and you guys do it again next week. What you guys saying?
For me, it's okay. I think Victor maybe had.
I'm going to Rio 24. Next week is 23.
23.
I can. I won't be able in the 30, but 23 I still can.
Perfect then.
Great.
Guys, this was amazing. Like so much stuff to. I'm totally fucked writing this blogging.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone who came.
Great seeing you all. Hope you're here for next time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks everyone.
See you all.
Bye. Bye,
Bye.
guys.
Take care.